right, but thank you all for coming. In the meantime, I guess I'd like to start by asking you all what you know about Alameda. What you think you know, what comes to your mind, if anything, when you think of Alameda. No Bart. This is true.
Victorian houses.
Bowling alley.
What did you say?
The bowling alley.
The bowling alley, Mel's bowling alley.
There's a beach.
Beautiful beach.
The beach.
Super polluted. That's why I think it on there.
Yeah. So I'm asking your what we call the geographical imagination. Anything? What did you say, Chloe?
Oh, he says come in Oxford. That's like a beautiful book.
Yeah. Okay. Anything? Nadia?
Was it the Navy base?
Navy base. So
Bases out there?
yeah, it used to be called Alameda, the Alameda Naval Air Station, and now Alameda Point. Make sure this is started. Okay.
You want to come up here? We can make room. I'm going to sit here at the end.
Head of the table. All right. So I'm gonna get out of my own way in a second. And I was trying to figure out how I could record this, but it's not working. And it may not be worth recording.
Oh,
About a 1 minute delay. About a 1 minute delay, I think,
Wow.
on here.
So that's good to know for
That could be because my internet connection is really slow. I don't know.
Blaine Berkeley. So thanks to Berkeley, Blaine Berkeley.
Yeah, that's good today.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming to be able to share my research about housing in Alameda. So before we start, I actually like to introduce or allow somebody to introduce themselves, and if we could all introduce ourselves. This is Kirby.
Hey, everyone.
Guest.
Yeah, my name's Kirby Lynch. I'm a second year undergraduate here, African American Studies. I've been kind of knowing what the Housing Institute does. I was a Roosevelt Institute Summer Academy Fellow, but I was at Oakland Housing Authority. Currently in the AACC as the Commissioner of Diversity Affairs. So just want to support Rashid. It's like been one of my early idols here. So yeah.
Ours too.
Welcome.
I'm Sarah. I'm a communications fellow. Study political economy. Senior. Work at the Daily Cab.
I'm Eli Moore, program manager to work in
I'm Chloe. I'm also a communications fellow. I'm a second year here. I'm studying political economy and statistics.
Rochelle, and I work with Rashid and Sarah and Chloe in communications and
I'm Stephen. I'm the director of research.
I'm Natalia. I'm a rhetoric major in my third year. I used to work here. Now I'm just hanging out.
Sadiq Al-Sheikh. I'm the Global Justice Program Director.
I'm Veronica Hash. I'm John's assistant, the director, and the administrative manager.
My name is Nadia. I work with Eli and Sadiq in Richmond and Global Justice Program.
Cool.
I'm Rachel. I'm also admin assistant, baking to be Johnson.
Yeah, I'm Rashid, one of the many people with a sound in their name here.
Good idea.
So I'm gonna set up this screen share and stop looking at my own face. So this presentation is called Alameda is Our Home, and it was the title of my undergraduate thesis. And I'll show you a slide where I got the idea for the name. But it was part of, like I asked what people's perceptions of Alameda were, because there's this idea in geography called the geographical imagination. It's the idea of when you think of a certain place, what is evoked? And so we know there's like racial coding that comes into that, and other perceptions that we associate with place. Certain smells evoke certain emotions and ideas. And so for Alameda, it's not a place that's ever been associated with African Americans. And part of that is because some of the things I outlined as far as housing discrimination, But really the idea came when in 2012, as I was working on my thesis, there was an article about J.R. Ryder. Anybody's basketball fans, he's from Alameda, from Parrot Village Housing Projects. And J.R., it was sort of showing the dichotomy, or not dichotomy, the distinction between J.R. Ryder being from Alameda and Jason Kidd being from Oakland, and they're very different paths. And Jason Kidd came to Cal and is now a coach and did all these things. But anyway, it was this idea that basically he was fronting. JR was doing all this hood activity because he didn't feel a sense of authenticity in being black, whereas Jason Kidd would not have had to do that because he's from Oakland. So anyway, all of these things kind of came into when I saw these protesters holding a sign, and you can vaguely or faintly see it in the background, but it says Alameda is our home. So yeah, I'll just get right to it. This is from the City of Alameda's website. So this is how they advertise the City of Alameda as a sophisticated Bay Area island community with a small town vibe, known for tree-lined streets, Victorian charm, low crime, and an excellent quality of life and high standard of living. For a very long time, and to this day, Alameda is known as the city of beaches and homes. And so there's a couple people who mentioned our beautiful, toxic beach, as well as the Victorian homes that they work very hard to prevent Black people from owning. So this is how the Oakland Tribune described the city of Alameda in 1988. Simultaneously a Navy town, a small middle American city, and an island of suburbia. And so sort of these three very distinct type of places all in one right here in the city of Alameda. Of course, the demographic being predominantly white with a higher household income than the majority of cities that surround Alameda. So where is Alameda? There's actually a t-shirt people used to sell that said, "Where is Alameda?" On your right, you can see it within the context of the East Bay in San Francisco. So it's an island city that's located in the middle of the bay, essentially parallel with the city of Oakland, and it's separated by a channel or an estuary that was created in 1902. And so it wasn't like in the 1960s with the Black Panthers and they dug this moat to keep Black people over there. That is also a perception people have. It was done in 1902. Welcome. It was done in 1902 to compete with Vallejo and other cities. There's also a second part of Alameda which has its own zip code, and it's Bay Farm Island, or Turtle Island as Jack London called it, and it was formerly the dump. But now very expensive homes are there. And then on your left side, we also have a map showing where Alameda is in relationship to Berkeley. And so, yeah, move on. So this is the outline that I'm gonna go through. I just gave you a lot of background on Alameda, my research questions. So this was sort of how I approached this, a more academic presentation. But I'm not gonna get into a lot of like housing jargon or Alameda slang or anything like that. I'm gonna show you a lot of photos and tell a couple stories about the struggle African Americans have had attempting to obtain housing, keep housing, and make sure it's at a high level of quality in the city of Alameda. So this is a little bit of different framing before I came to Haas, and so how I now understand some of these things. But this is what I operated on when I utilized when I did my research. And so the definition of discrimination, particularly racial discrimination, being unequal treatment of persons on the basis of their race or ethnicity. And so now I also talk about the different outcomes. So it's not only just whatever the intent, but also what is the actual impact of this bias that people have. A quick look at the population, the total population of Alameda, and as well as the Black population. I know it'd be a little nicer if I had some infographics. That's another thing we can, comms team can do, right? But as you can see, the Black population of Alameda was very small, and until maybe 1940, when there was a large increase. And so that was part of the Black migration to the West, and so people fleeing the South or going towards different opportunities here in the West, primarily jobs, but also escaping the Jim Crow South. So you can see in 1940, there were just 249 Black people in the city of Alameda, at least that were counted by census takers. But by 1944, there was over 4,000. And so a huge expansion occurred. But you can see a few decades later, by 1970, it dropped in half. And this was due to, as I'll outline, the destruction of housing projects to which Black people were primarily confined. And so what my original research question was how has prejudice in the local and regional housing market impacted African Americans in the city of Alameda? And so that's what I'll primarily be answering today. My method to go about this, I looked at a lot of different government documents, ranging from stuff in the, forgot what that place is called, the National Archives in San Bruno, the City Council, Housing Authority, but also ephemeral. So looking at photographs, posters, and flyers from different eras and time periods. I used a lot of newspaper articles, and so there's actually a clipping file at the Alameda Library just on housing, and then also some oral history interviews. So some that had already taken place, and then a few that I conducted myself. And then of course my own experience, which is in the latter part of the presentation. And the framework I utilized was multi or interdisciplinary. So I did this as an undergrad thesis for African American Studies, and I was able to pull from different methods from a lot of different places. So history, geography, urban planning, political science, which was my other major, and then also sociology, which gave me a lot of cool theories and things to think about and use and not actually write, just sit around, think about stuff. One of those theories that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to share with you all today is the production of space. And someone here can probably tell me how to pronounce this guy's name. French guy, I want to say Lefebvre, but you know, I learned my Spanish, my French from Pepe Le Pew, so I'm not really, that good. But he had this theory around space and social space being produced and reproduced in connection with the forces of production and the relations of production, and that spaces are not empty or neutral or a space determined solely by geography, climate, or anthropology. So as an example of this space that we have here today, we both simultaneously create this space, like it does exist physically, but by all of us coming here and contributing to that space, we create it, but we're also impacted by the space that we create. So it's not just something neutral, but it's a very interactive thing. So now I'm gonna get to all the cool photos. That's something like the background wanted to introduce. And these are some of the very cool photos and stories I want to tell you. So this house is at it was at 1608 Union Street in the city of Alameda. It was built by the Hackett family, James R. Hackett and his wife Marie. They were the first Black family to get their home in the city of Alameda. They moved there from San Francisco in 1865 and had their own apartment on Oak Street near where the library is today. And they built this house and moved in 1890. There's actually an oral history interview, and I was able to listen actually to the audio tape of their daughter, and it's at the San Francisco Public Library. And she remembers the day when she walked from Oak Street down to she didn't get on a horse. What do you call this thing? The trolley, and rode to their new home. And so did that interview in 1978. But this was a home in the north side of the city of Alameda, the north side, and it became a space that was used for a lot of different things. So Alameda didn't have its own Black church like some other cities, like the city of Oakland. And so the Hackett family actually used to host a Sunday school there. And they had political meetings for the Colored Citizens Civic League and these different groups. And so one of the things, like, I wish I would have known of opportunity-based housing prior to writing this, but understanding how housing is not just housing in and of itself. It's a baseline for other opportunities. And so they actually use this house to create other opportunities. So political gatherings, what's called chain migration. So where family members would move in and then get their own housing. And so that's what a number of other people were able to do. And so anyway, yeah, this is 1608 Union Street. This is a photo of the Hackett family. And it didn't have the year on it. I got this image from the African American Museum and Library in the city of Oakland. But based on like the ages of some of the children, I estimate in the 20s or the 1930s. But let me show y'all who the folks are. So this is actually, this is another Hackett family. This is Sylvester Hackett, and I want to say his wife's name is Sylvia, but I've actually forgotten. But this is the family and their children. This is like a nephew. And, you know, you can kind of look at this photo. They were living the middle class life in the city of Alameda. They got their cool little curtains, and they got their little coffee and tea stuff all up in the background, right? So moving on, this is another family, another image of a Hackett family. So Alice, that was her name, sorry. So yeah, this is Sadie Hackett, who actually was the daughter who had that interview I referenced. And this is outside the second home of the Hackett family, S.R. Hackett or Sylvester, at 1828 Grand Street. And so it was their New Year's Day, and I talked to one of the grandsons, and he told me they would do this thing every year up till 1960s. Not always at that house, but also at the other house. On the top right-hand corner is 1828 Grand Street, from a photo from a few years ago, and that's actually the central substation for Alameda Power and Electric. And so where their home used to be is now the substation for the electric company in the city of Alameda. Now, when I was researching to find out, well, how did that happen? A local writer, or pardon me if this seems snarky, but historian wrote something for the electrical company that said that that the electrical company purchased all the different property around, and then they later got federal funds. So from the WPA, what's it called, the Works Progress Administration, to construct this during the New Deal, or 1934. So apparently, or allegedly, they bought all of this property. However, after searching for months, I couldn't find any records at the Alameda Assessor's Office about this. And then when I read about the city manager at that time, Mr. Fritz, he later was sent to San Quentin for a range of illegal activities. Talking to, again, one of the grandsons, he told me that it was eminent domain that was used. But that was after I published this. And again, I wasn't able to find any records of that. But based on the criminality of this city manager, and also there were 3 city council members who also went to jail along with him, something very suspect happened, and the historical writings on this, on behalf of the electrical company, have essentially just excused this. So, but that's still a question mark. So no silver bullet on that, but I don't trust that writer. Yeah.
Was the electrical company run by the municipality or the county?
It was run by the municipality. So Alameda is unique in the sense that it has its own electrical company. And so when PG&E does strange things related to electricity, that doesn't always impact Alamedans. But as far as like gas, that is run by PG&E.
Is that because it's an island, so they want to?
No, it was a political decision made a long time ago in the 1800s to construct its own station. Yeah, and so it initially used to be on Park Street, where there's actually these are like the hood landmarks, but there's the AMPM. Yeah, that's the cheap gas station, yeah, right across from the Jack in the Box by the KFC, over by Alameda High. That's where the substation used to be. But again, in 1934, they built it on the house that I suspect and suggest that they stole from the Hackett family. So this is a photo of the Hackett family in 1952, and this is at the 1608 address. And so that actually was torn down for an apartment complex, but the family sold it. And I'll talk more about houses being destroyed for Victorians, because that's one of the justifications for a policy that I'll also be discussing. So I want to show you another cool map. Does anyone, besides Stephen, know what this map is? I probably could say besides Kirby, but anyone want to share? It's an old map.
Hulk.
Hulk.
The homeowners.
There you go.
Red line.
Yeah. So yes, Eli outlined, this is what we call redlining map. So it was done by the on behalf of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and these were maps that were created that were used to justify who could basically get loans in different areas. And so this is actually for the core of the East Bay, so Oakland, Berkeley, and the city of Alameda. And what you'll see in this map, I have one of those little cool pointer things I left at home. But so again, this is Alameda here at the bottom, and this is how the island looks today, this whole piece. But this is where it was actually built up at this time, right? Because a lot of this, as I talked about, was, or I'll just say it now, this was built when the Navy base came. So this is primarily marshland. But what you'll see in this map is some areas are red, some areas are blue, some are yellow, and some are green. And so the green areas were kind of like you think of green, right? It's nice and fertile, great for investment, deserving of investment. So that's what you have up here in Piedmont. And whatever your geographical imagination is of Piedmont, you can like go with that. But then there's also the blue areas, and so those weren't as fertile. But you know, you need water to marinate your soil, right? So those were the areas in which they weren't as risky as investment. Yellow areas, those were very questionable. You might not want to put your money there. And then other areas were designated as red. And so, interesting, the city of Oakland, all the flatlands have been red. And then the areas higher up in the hill, higher up on the hog, as some people would say, they are green and blue. Now, what made these different places such risky investments? And so, in one instance, to talk about the city of Alameda, where the north side of the island, and that's where the Hackett's family home was, it was because you had, quote unquote, infiltration of people of color and a group of people who were then referred to as Orientals. And so primarily referring to Chinese, but also it referred to Japanese as well. And so because those folks lived there, it was not a good investment. Not because these folks didn't necessarily have money, they just weren't a good investment. And because predominantly at that time, white residents, well, it also occurs today, preferred to live in segregated areas, to live amongst other white people. So there's actually this house where this one black family lived, which was like right over here, north of Park Street, and there was a listing about it being infiltrated as a neighborhood, and that's why it got the yellow ranking. But I'll show you a link. You can actually go on to this Tumblr I made, and you can see these different maps, and you can read the actual descriptions that they made for each of these different areas. So C28, C whatever.
What year approximately is that map?
That's a great question. I'm actually not sure. I want to say it was like 39, but I think it may be as early as 35. So I can look at some citations and get that for you.
The 880 line kind of running?
Yeah, great question.
But the 880 wasn't built, right?
No, it was like 880 has, well, not in its current form, right? Because the Highway Act was later, but that's been like a road since like the indigenous people before the Spanish colonized.
That's East 14th International.
Yeah, no, East 14th is up here, and that goes like that. But yeah, this is there was another name for what we now known as 880. Before it was named the Nimitz and all of that. But like a lot of these
US 17.
17.
Yeah, the ones that goes down to Santa Cruz. Here,
Right. Yeah. And so like those paths before it was like El Camino Real during the Spanish time. Actually, let me try to look a little closer. It does actually say on this map. Yeah, I did that for y'all. All right, so I want to move on. So I mentioned that so they commissioned the Navy base for the city of Alameda, and it was built in 1940. And so that built out all of this this land that was right here. And that's why I say 39, because all the stuff was being planned at the time. And so that ushered in a huge change in the city of Alameda. In fact, there was actually a debate on whether the city would create its own housing or if the Federal Housing Authority would basically take the land and build their own housing. And so that's why the city of Alameda created its own housing authority, which a lot of cities also did. So they would have some measure of control of where housing would be, how much housing, etc. So in 1941, the first housing projects were built in the city of Alameda. And it's called Woodstock Homes. And so for folks who went with us to Richmond, to Atchison Village, it looks identical to those. It's the same type of housing. And it was also the same situation on who would actually get the housing. So a little bit of background on the military at that time. You may recall that the military was segregated. Hi, bye. All right. So the military was segregated at that time. And so this housing was built primarily for white Americans. And so you see this beautiful family moving in with the baby and their coffee and got his cool little pipe and flooded pants. And I've been trying to figure out which house that was because I know that neighborhood, but I haven't been able to do it yet. But yeah, so that's who was able to move into the Woodstock Homes. That's still there today. And I've talked to so many residents. Like I used to hang out in there. We used to call it the mazes because there's all these little pathways you can go in people's backyards. You probably shouldn't trespass, but we were children. And we've not known any black people who've lived in there. I've looked at the census data, lock level data, and I haven't been able to find that any black people have actually lived in there. And so again, this is it's now been made a cooperative. And so just like Atchison Village, this was bought by the residents. And so again, this is an instance of one group of people being able to benefit from this housing. This is the estuary housing. And so this is the best photo I've been able to get thus far, but I'm trying to get some from former residents. And so these were built in 1944. And the estuary projects were one of about 8 or 9 projects that were built in the city of Alameda. And these projects were segregated. People had to live on different blocks. So if you were white, you would live over here. If you're black, you live here. If you were Filipino, you might live in sort of a median area. If you were in an interracial relationship and one of them were black, you lived in the black area of the projects. And in fact, I found a letter in the NAACP archives of someone complaining about this, about the segregated housing. So the short story of the estuary projects would be that, again, it was segregated housing initially, but over time, because of the federal loans that were being given to predominantly white residents in the States, white people were able to move out of the projects and get houses, whereas blacks could not get housing elsewhere in Alameda based on restrictive covenants. So these were actually written into deeds that you couldn't, primarily it was targeting African Americans from the ones I've read in the city of Alameda, but oftentimes it would also list Jewish people, quote unquote Orientals again, and one other group that is escaping me at this time. So folks couldn't move out of the projects, and so over time it became predominantly black. And in many instances, people associate projects with black people, and part of that is because that's the only people who that's who still lived in the project. So in the case of the estuary projects, whereas at one point it looked more like this, where you had some level of integration, at a later point it was just all black folks who lived in the project, besides either a few very poor white people or people who are, again, in these interracial relationships. So this is John Muir. school that was located in the Alameda Estuary housing projects. And the projects were a really interesting place. They had 2 churches. One was the black church and one was the white church. The black church was also where they formed the NAACP and did a lot of organizing. And whereas there's a church in East Oakland, which is on 70th, and it's Herbert Geis, and there's like the Herbert Geis Academy. The Geises and Carter Gilmore. I don't know if these names is like Oakland people who are known. Carter Gilmore was the first black person elected to the city council in the city of Oakland. But they're known as the leaders of like a lot of the advocacy around housing and education. But in reality, there was black women like Mabel Tatum who really led this fight. And so when I started my research, I had heard the name Carter Gilmore and I kept looking for him, but nope, didn't really find him. But I found Mabel Tatum. And so Mabel Tatum, she's right up there in the front. You probably already know who I'm talking about, but her right here, Miss Mabel Tatum. And she was the leader of the estuary housing fight. And so what ended up happening in 1964, the same time as Prop 14 was passed, which I'll talk about in a moment, residents were going to be forced out. And so they led this picket down Webster Street. This is actually Webster and Taylor Street. If you ever go to Alameda and you want to go get you some nice cheesecake or something, you can go over, or pecan pie, you can go to that Nations. That's on Webster Street. And right where that Nations is, this is directly, this photo right here is pointed towards the post office, and you can see the American flag in the background. There's a cleaner still there, and also a liquor store known as Santos now. But yeah, this was a fight, and it was primarily black women and children. And I've read some articles, people saying, well, where were the men at? Well, they were fighting in not Korea, but Vietnam at that time. So there were some people who tried to push this rhetoric about black families, men not being there, and they were, of course, fighting in what some people might call imperialist war in Vietnam. But I'll digress from that. So this is down the street in Eagle Village, this housing project that's actually still here, but it's been flipped a little bit. And this is where the housing authority offices were. And so folks marched down the street and they picketed the housing offices. So these photos are actually from the Bancroft Library, and you can see that in all the previous stuff. So I mentioned Prop 14. So this same year, was it about? Oh, this is the same protest. So they were going to be forced out of the estuary housing projects. And so this is why, actually, you can read some of these signs. So forced out, low rent needed, the housing authority is unfair, housing discrimination. And so they were picketing because what ended up happening, so earlier in the presentation, I talked about this jump, right, from 249 black people in 1940 to over 4,000 in 1944. And then by 1970, you had about 1,800. And so what happened in the 1950s was redevelopment. And this redevelopment was to either tear down or renovate housing projects. And so what the city of Alameda chose to do was tear all of this housing down. And so a number of people who lived in certain projects, they would go essentially project to project because they couldn't find housing elsewhere in Alameda. And so they would find housing in these other projects, which continually neglected repairs. Even though they collected the rents, they didn't do any substantive repairs. And so by 1964, estuary was one of the last ones that actually existed. And so they ended up, that was their last place that they could actually live. And like one of the signs said, Alameda is our home. This is where we live. And so they were fighting to keep their homes. So this same year was when Proposition 14 was passed by Alameda voters. So there had been a law which is known as the Rumford Act, which was to prevent housing discrimination. So Byron Rumford was an assembly member here in the city of Berkeley. He's from Berkeley, lived in South Berkeley, had a pharmacy here. And he got this act passed after like over a decade of not agitation, attempting to get this thing passed. And so basically it was to say that if you had an apartment complex, you couldn't discriminate in who you would rent this out to. Or not just apartment complex, but so many units. And so what some people did, the California realtors, they pushed for a proposition to be on the ballot. And it's very interesting framing that they did. They framed it around freedom. you should have the freedom to rent your house to whoever you want to. And they called the Rumford Fair Housing Act the Rumford Forced Housing Act, because big government, I'm using some like rhetoric we hear today, right? Big government is trying to force people into your apartment. They're trying to put them in your house, right? Miscegenate with your daughter. Anyway, so the Rumford, they call it the Rumford Forced Housing Act. And this is the frame they use. Restore your freedom to sell and rent your property to anyone you choose, right? Stop these police state tactics. Promote friendly community relations, because we know integrated housing is not very friendly in 1964, not in Alameda. Also restore constitutional protection to homeowners. So sort of using this this constitutional rhetoric, and they called it tyranny. They created a fair housing commission, and they just essentially framed it as being tyrannical, trying to, again, force people in your homes. And also these heavy economic losses.
Remove risk. That's funny. Remove risk of heavy economic losses.
Yeah, and so part of that is because certain bodies, and particularly black bodies, became associated with the loss of property value. So meaning that if, again, like I said, if someone moved in your neighborhood and they had a little bit too much melanin, then you could lose property value. And so on the flip side, other people were associated with higher economic value. And that's just the larger sort of like things we deal with in this society, with whose lives are valued often. So I'm going to skip to a protest that took place in 1966. So the residents of Estuary continued to agitate, led by Miss Mabel Tatum. And so some of y'all may have been here at Berkeley when they had Occupy Cal. And, remember I had all these tents that were out there on Sproul or Occupy Oakland. Well, black residents in the Estuary projects and their allies then did the camp in. Already did the tents. So they had a tent in, or a camp in, as they called it, in Franklin Park. Now, Franklin Park is an area of Alameda known as the Gold Coast. Really, really nice houses. One day we'll do a little tour over there. And so basically they took it to the heart of who the wealthy people in Alameda were. In fact, when I looked at the person who designed the estuary projects, so this is the architect, right, who got the contract, the architect and builder who got all the contracts. When I looked at the mayor of the city of Alameda at that time, they all lived right around the park. Like, I mean, on the streets that bordered this park. And so what Estuary Projects did, they did a tent in, or a camp in, and they went and camped in at this park. Interesting thing that the residents accused the fire department of taking their hoses and actually not spraying the people, as we know is a common practice during this era, but they sprayed the actual grass. And so they attempted to make it very damp so it wouldn't be an attractive place for people to go camping in protest. So they did this camping tactic, and they were able to get sort of like a moratorium and extend their time in the estuary. So I'm about 30 minutes. I want to flip through some current history really quickly. But ultimately, the folks were displaced and they lost their housing in the city of Alameda. This is a more current picture of what's called the Atlantic Apartments. Us in Alameda, we know it as the Pogies. It's actually pronounced Pogi for this Italian family, but we call it the Pogies. And it's where you'll find a lot of Bosnians, Eritreans, and folks today, but and Afghanis. But back in 1967, they would not rent to black people. And so there was actually a lawsuit that took place, and it went to this tyrannical bureaucratic commission that they were talking about. And it was headed by C.L. Dellums. So there's this fair housing group, and they would decide on these different cases. And so they actually decided in favor of the tenants. And so that actual housing discrimination had occurred and that they would have to rent. And so this led to sort of demographic change over time in not only those apartments, but also the area. So I'm gonna just fast forward. There's another map of the city of Alameda, and it's more current. I'm gonna be focusing on, this area of Alameda. We call all of this the West End. But primarily this census tract right here. And so in the 1970s, again, a lot of folks were forced out a lot of people moved from Estuary to the Makassar Straits projects. Makassar Straits were torn down in the 1980s. A similar situation with Estuary. At that time, it was primarily Black and Filipino residents, and a lot of them moved to some apartments, as the BVs or the Buena Vistas, which I'll talk about shortly. But those are located right here. And so folks moved there. In the 1980s, you had a huge housing crisis, thanks to former governor, then President Reagan. So in addition or beyond the housing market and so many people moving here, increased immigration, you also had huge cuts to federal housing. And so Reagan cut HUD by, I read one number as high as 80%, but just say he cut it by a lot of money. But then also you had issues with different cities competing for residents and a decrease in the number of affordable housing. And so what ended up happening in the city of Alameda, you did begin to have an increase of Black residents, primarily in the Buena Vista apartments, which I'll show you a photo of. And what ended up happening is that these low-income tenants, it's so many different things, so I'm trying to make sure I don't take for granted all the random little factoids I know and not tell you too much detailed stuff. So the Buena Vista apartments were actually built in 1964 and 65, and they got a federal loan, a subsidized loan to build these apartments. To get this loan, they agreed to subsidize the apartments, the rentals, for about 20 years, for at least 20 years. At that point, the landlord or property owner could pay off the rest of the mortgage and begin to go back to market rate. And so in 1987, that's what this homeowner decided to do. So homeowners were going to have their rents raised by, or not homeowners, pardon me, apartment owners or renters were going to have their apartment rents raised by essentially double. So you may be paying $300 for rent. I know that sounds like really great, right? $300, even $361 was the highest one. So they were going to go up to $500 minimum. And I know that sounds cool, but if you're only paying $300 rent and you have limited income, having your rent double would be really difficult, right? So they pleaded with the city council, or pled with city council. They went to the landlord and tried to get their rents reduced or have it phased in over time. But ultimately, the landlord decided not to and decided to double their rents. But one of the things that this landlord, Gersten Company, wanted to do was actually get Section 8 vouchers. And so, while on the face of it, it sounds cool. Like, well, you're going to raise these folks' rent, but let's get them Section 8. And Section 8 being something that pays part of your rent. But in actuality, that essentially just benefits the landlord, right? Because they're going to have their rent subsidized regardless. And even though the tenant is not going to have to pay much more, they're still getting the maximum amount of money that they want to get paid. And so ultimately, that's what ended up happening. And that's what the landlord's intention was. So what ends up happening, not everybody qualified for Section 8 vouchers. 325 families couldn't get it because they were too poor to afford the rent increase, but they weren't poor enough to get Section 8. And so they decided to sue the city of Alameda for discriminatory housing policies. So I'm going to jump back really quick. And so in 1970, bye, Sarah. She already said, don't get mad when you leave. No. So in 1973, the majority white electorate of the city of Alameda passed a housing policy, which is known as Measure A. And this housing policy essentially banned any apartments being constructed in the city of Alameda. Now, earlier I talked a little bit about the Hackett family and their house being sold and becoming an apartment complex, right? So a lot of Victorian homes in the 1950s were torn down to build housing. There was a huge, housing, housing shortage that took place. And so a lot of houses were torn down to create apartment complexes. And so the Hackett family, this happened to them as well. And so even though it wasn't happening as much in the late 60s and early 70s, this was used as the justification. Also issues around traffic was used as a justification to pass Measure A. And so essentially it said you couldn't build any apartments bigger than a townhouse or anything with 3 or more units. And so that took place in 1973, and that sort of set the context for all of the development that took place up until 2012. And so these tenants, they sued the city of Alameda for discriminatory land use policy. So one they targeted was the Measure A policy, but also something I call the CLUP, which is just another great acronym for the Combined Land Use Plan. And essentially it said that the city of Alameda could not have a proportion of low-income housing that is equal or more than any other city surrounding it. So another way of saying it is like, we don't want as many poor people as they have in other cities nearby. We don't want to have that many apartment or renters. We want to have homeowners. So they sued for this policy. And so the judge in this case, Alameda County case, said that, yes, the policies discriminate against poor people in this preliminary ruling. What ultimately ended up happening, they were going to go to trial, and they were going to see does Measure A actually discriminate on racial grounds. And that's a little bit harder to prove because this whole issue around intent. Regardless of actual impact, there had to be this sort of intent that had to be proven. And so ultimately the parties settled. And so these low-income tenants, the Guyton family in Henderson, who I'll show you some cool pictures of later, they got legal assistance from legal aid, Bay Area legal aid, and they settled. In this settlement, they said that there would be an exemption to Measure A to replace the quote-unquote lost units that were taking place during the Buena Vista conversion, so the Buena Vista apartments, converting from subsidized to market rate. Also, developers would have to contribute to an affordable housing development fund and provide affordable housing units for 59 years. This was in 1989, this settlement took place. The city would also have to apply for rental housing construction funds, and they would have to pay legal aid. In 1992, they declined to apply for the rental housing construction funds and have repeatedly done this. And also, not much of the housing little housing has actually been built. There's have been other lawsuits take place in order to do that. So this is a photo of the Guyton family. Remember this cool guy's face? So he is with his wife, Dolores, their daughter, Janelle, who I had a crush on for the longest time, friends now, and the sons on the slide, Clayton Jr. and Shotty, who was a really cool music producer. So this is a cool dot map. I'm gonna like flip through the 90s. The Buena Vista apartments, the owner, Gersten, went into bankruptcy, sold the apartments to some slumlords from Florida, known as the 15 Group, I'll talk a little bit about. And this is like in 2000. So this is what the East Bay sort of looked like. So if you remember that map I showed y'all with the redlining, so these are one of these dot maps where the, I don't know, magenta looking color is for white residents, green is for Asian, gold, yellow is for Latinos, and blue is for African Americans, right? So you can see majority of the city of Alameda is primarily white in 2000. Now it's actually nearly plurality Asian. You can see large population of Asians here. Fruitvale, Latinos, and then Deep East Oakland, African Americans. We have this one little area right here where you have a huge cluster of African Americans, and that's that area I was pointing to, which is the Buena Vista. So that was in 2000. And so what was happening at that time? The Navy base was being closed down. And so there was a huge fight about what would you do with this housing that already exists there. And so housing activists wanted to save East Housing. There's actually a documentary called Beyond These Gates that folks did. I have it on VHS. And it was to save East Housing and can basically convert this housing into multifamily housing. Because what happened when the military came, you would have really large families. People used to make a lot more babies than we do today. And so you would have 3 and 4 bedroom homes, right? But the city leaders wanted to have more upscale housing and single family housing, and essentially $1 million homes. And so this is a photo of the Buena Vistas, which then became the Harbor Island. And this is right before we were forced out, which I'll talk about. You see they didn't even water the grass. This tree is actually still there. That tree is gone. But this is the corner of Buena Vista and Poggi. And then this is the entrance to the apartment. So you'll see something that reminds you of that. And this is right across the street, across the old railroad track, in fact, the Bayport housing. And so they built $1 million homes across the street from what had been formerly subsidized housing, and which was the last refuge for Black families, or one of the last refuges for Black low-income renters. And so there's a bunch of other stuff I have to say for another presentation, and I'll just flip through to the next slide. So the same month, in fact, that people moved in across the street in the Bayport, families on the other side of the railroad tracks in the Buena Vistas got notices that we had to move. In this bottom corner, it's a 90-day notice to quit. You got 90-day notice to move.
What day was this?
This was July 2004. So actually July, I want to say July 20th or July 22nd.
22nd.
Yeah.
So
It's on
land
the
shackle.
Right on, good read. So yeah, July 22nd, 2004, my family, me and my mom, we got a 60-day notice to quit. So you got 90-day notice if you got federal aid for your housing, so Section 8. You got 60 days if you live there longer than 2 years per California law. If you live somewhere over 2 years, actually it may be, a year, pardon me. You would have at least 60 days. And if you live there less than a year, you got 30 days notice that you would have to move. And so it wasn't an eviction, it's called a tenancy termination. So basically eliminating the contract, and it's legal in California to do this. And so I actually knew a family who moved in beginning of July 22nd, got a notice that they had 30 days.
Even if someone had a longer lease?
You can terminate the lease. So, but a lot of people were on month-to-month leases also. And so that was a way in which they were able to do that. So we did what a lot of tenants do, Black folks been doing since being kidnapped and brought here, far back. And so that is Modessa Henderson. She on the top left-hand corner. Yeah, she was one of the plaintiffs in that lawsuit against the city of Alameda. A spokesperson at the top right-hand corner. This is a city council meeting. And so we went up and people spoke. One of my favorite people on earth, this lady, Rose Mosetta London. She was actually not a resident, but she came out in our defense, and she actually had an oxygen tank that she had to carry with her. But that stopped her respiratory speaking out on our behalf, and forever love her for that. And then at the bottom was the tenants meeting at the Chipman Middle School, which is right next door. So I actually want to just show y'all a video that sort of outlines this. I showed this during the summer for some folks that were here for, I think it was another brown bag or something we were doing. Just
Fellows presentation, I think it was.
Yeah, so show you this video.
Just open the door. Sorry, because there's nobody out there. So if somebody comes in, I want to hear. Thank you.
That's actually not playing. Hold on. I think that I don't think I just put in a blank slide, but all right. Let me load this video on the internet. So actually at this point, I'll take any questions that anybody has at this point on almost anything under the sun, what I've talked about, as I be apt through. Okay, keep it moving.
You know what happened with the requirement to put money towards affordable housing? Did that fund grow? Did they just build it elsewhere?
Great question. I don't have a definitive answer for that. When I talked to someone at the city, the fund still exists. I was told that it has been diverted for some other, like, it's housing related, but not necessarily affordable housing. So it's something I haven't fully looked into. But when I interviewed Clayton Guyton, who was the gentleman I showed y'all the photo of, he told me that if somebody ever looks into this, it'll bankrupt the city. So, like, saying another lawsuit needs to happen, and he wishes that he didn't settle. So, but that's what he said. I don't know for sure. So this is a film that was done. It was a 5-year documentary from the San Francisco Foundation's Caution Fund. So they focus on different neighborhoods. And so right in the middle of this, we were forced to move. And so this is called, they called it the Battle of Harbor Island. Yeah, so I'll show y'all this. Let me actually, I don't need the sound, right?
It won't come I don't know if it's gonna
speaker
come out of the TV or the computer.
right here. Okay.
Sounds like it's on TV.
Yeah.
Well, I think what makes this community what it is the diversity. And it has been a place for a long time for people to feel safe and feel like all families were welcome. And it's not feeling very welcoming right now. There's a huge transition happening. We call it regentrification, where there has been a development. They are building very expensive homes on that property. And as a result, there are major apartment owners who want to go in and rehab and redo their apartment buildings to get more rent.
Welcome to Alameda, California. Right now I'm standing in front of the Rental Assistance Center of the Harbor Island Apartments. On July 22nd, about 400 residents received notices to vacate or eviction notices that they would have to leave the apartments. Just want to invite you along to take a tour of what I used to call my home. Well, this place to the right, the boarded up apartment, looks like they moved out right there. It's where KG used to live, one of my best friend in elementary. They were fortunate enough to find an apartment in Alameda. The majority of residents have been relocated elsewhere.
Yes, sir. I'm with the owners of the property, and they're asking that all media do whatever they have to do from the sidewalk or whatever. Do not be on the property.
Even as my guests, I thought we went through this yesterday.
They're not allowed on the property.
And I can understand they're business people, and I can understand they mean business, but what about the little people? It's not right, because you got many people like myself that's very disabled, and what are these people supposed to do? They don't have a heart. They do not have a heart. They see all these people and what they have done to them, and they don't even care. And you know what? When they sit down at their table and they eat dinner every night with their family, and when they're sitting there and they're laughing, it's people sitting here crying because they don't have a place to go.
Our purpose for this meeting this evening is to tell you what's going on with the property and to give the tenants the opportunity to communicate directly with the owners. Owners, we have Mark Sanders, Ian Sanders. They are the corporate president and CEO of 15 Group. And we have Mark Hartney, who is an advisor.
These are old buildings, and they're at the point in their life cycle where they need a very comprehensive renovation plan. Of some of the feedback we've already received, we're ready to take concrete steps to help with the transition. What I'd like to do is discuss some of the steps that we are prepared to take at this time. We will be paying a $750 per unit moving stipend.
I think that what you're offering in terms of $700 is an insult. Because $700 does not buy you anything.
That's not going to help us, sir.
You feel necessary to move us out of here like we're a horse and just shoot them and put them out to pasture.
This little extra stuff is nothing. We don't need that. We need to know, are you going to increase this money where we can move, where it's possible to move?
You say get out. I just canceled my damn surgery because I don't know if I'm going to have a roof over my head or not. And according to you, I'm not.
These children, that's what I'm worried about, these children. You know what they said to me? Do we have to leave? We can't go to school? Where are we going to live? Do you think about that?
How long have you been in destroying communities and homelessness and turning the lives, the children's lives upside down? Is that a pattern that you are familiar with and therefore you have no emotional response to it? You can talk all day long on a legal level, but as a human being, do you operate from any kind of moral
That's my home. I just renovated my home. I spent the $600 to renovate my home, put in the road. I painted home. I did everything in my home. It's a model, my home. It's beautiful. And now you people are gonna take it away from me. I'm a senior citizen. I can't move. I have asthma. I can't walk. I can't lift. Who's gonna move me? And my deposit, the one I'm moving here, it was $90. So I don't even have enough for money to move. I cannot move. I cannot move. You guys move me. You find a place for me and move me.
Take a look at the people in this room. You are not ever gonna find a group of people as diverse as what you have here. We have whites, we have blacks, we have Latins, we have Asians, we have Africans from the motherland, we have Arabs, we have Muslims, we have Jews, we have Christians, we have non-English speaking people, but I'm here because these are my neighbors, these are my friends, and they're a part of me. So when you hurt one of us, you hurt all of us. This is all about our community, and that's what we're all about. So I'm just saying, look at these people, look at the human side, show some compassion, and work with us, because if you don't work with us, we're going to fight you anyway.
All right. So again, that was 2004, and over 60. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the impact, like what happened after that. So in the midst of being forced out, actually the day I moved out was the day Bush stole the second election, and yeah, very interesting day. As we're looking for housing, Sentinel Fair Housing, excuse me, Sentinel Fair Housing, a housing group that's actually no longer active, they did a report finding that there was a racial bias in people trying to find rents. And so based on some of the media coverage that criminalized me and my neighbors, a lot of people were facing bias. So, you know, we were talking about this, I guess, yesterday. Tyrone calls for, Tyrone being proxy for a black person, right, calls to get a rental housing and they're not able to get one. But in some, or not even someone else, we just weren't, no one was trying to rent to us in the midst of all of this. That's this lady, Isalina, a very talented artist, and one of the people who was the last to leave. Some of the aftermath of what happened after you forced out over 400 families, right, from a small town, from a closer-knit community. One of the elementary schools, actually my elementary school, Longfellow, was closed. And that's based because you have to have so many people attending, right, to get state funding. And so based on the average daily attendance, 65% of the children that lived in the Harbor Island or in the Harbor Island apartments left the city of Alameda. And so that's the school, which based on neighborhood boundaries, that attended there. So they closed that school down. There was actually a plan at that time to close another school, which was nearby Woodstock School. And so essentially what happened in the new Bayport development, they built a new school that they ironically named after a black woman named Ruby Bridges, who y'all may know for school. And they closed down 3 schools of 3 different diverse neighborhoods and forced those children to go across the street to Ruby Bridges because we're so integrated. There were 2 deaths associated with the move, including one of my friend's grandmothers. Sorry, or pardon me. And 50% of black people left that census tract. So as I wrote, I think most of y'all know I had a different name. And you found the same guy, right? Professor Rothstein was searching for Reginald, couldn't find him. And he reached out to Rashid. He was like, hey, you know this Reginald guy? Like, yeah, I think I know him. But I wrote in this Indie Bay article in 2005 that there was an organized effort to remove our community. And so this is where I got beyond looking at individualized prejudice and understanding how policies and things work. And so when the city adopted Measure A, this was a policy that created this context of exclusion. There was also a Harbor Island task force, not the police task force, right, that some of y'all may know about, but actually the police were on this task force along with people in the city, fire, emergency services, to look at some of the issues that we faced in Harbor Island, yet they didn't actually include residents in this task force. And so that was going on. There was also the decision to create Bayport, this sort of rich community with just a few apartments that are all off on the side over there by Target. I mean, just a range of different. First question on it, and all the people we asked, like, what is going on with this? The question asked, does living in a racially, socially, and economically diverse community create problems for residents? And so a lot of the residents that we surveyed, they were like, what is this? What does this question mean? What does it have to do with those new houses being created across the street? So again, this is an organized effort to just talk about some current issues. This is a census tract. So the pink one is the one that I live in now. I actually live on the edge of it, but that's where the Buena Vistas are. And that was, again, the most diverse racially, but also had the largest proportion of children, largest proportion of senior citizens, largest proportion of people with disabilities, and the largest proportion of foreign language speaking people who were primarily dispersed, or we call ourselves now the Buena Vista diaspora. Above that is another census tract, which includes Alameda Point, which there's a large proportion of poor people. Actually, it's one of the 5 poorest neighborhoods in the Bay Area, in 9 counties of the Bay Area, because they have a formerly battered women's shelter there, veterans housing, formerly homeless shelter, and other low-income housing. What's interesting about how the census tract was redrawn from 2000 to 2010, whereas the census tract, one census tract used to be right here, 4287, and this was a separate census tract. They've now combined both of these. This is where the Bayport housing is. And so one of the things when you start to try to look at data at the census level, you know, you can narrow down and kind of find out disparities and what different incomes are. Well, now you have one of the more richer areas on the West End right next to the poorest area. And so it masks some of the inequality that exists between those two different communities. In 2012, Occupy Oakland's homeowner foreclosure defense group came to the aid of Jody, whose daughter Ciante used to be my babysitter, and she was facing foreclosure while she was going through her chemotherapy. In fact, while she was out during her chemotherapy, the bank broke into her house and changed her locks. Folks broke back in, changed the locks again, and initiated foreclosure home defense. Defend Jody. Actually, I wrote my thesis in her living room. She died last summer after her battle, but so Ciante and her son Darnell still live there. So where are they now? Well, Rashid is still here. And I'm still pushing through tears. Clayton Guyton is in Baltimore. He is still doing housing work. He runs the Rose Center. What's it called? The Rose Community Center. And they provide housing to formerly homeless teenagers. And, pardon, give me a moment. You know, I be trying to have my voice all deep and stuff, and you know, when your voice all crackly, you crying, that's not all masculine. And then Modessa is still doing work around housing. She's, they actually, every time they do some housing work in the city of Alameda, because of this lawsuit, the settlement is still in place, they actually have to call her up. And so she's still pushing. And then today in the city of Alameda, a lot of people's rents are still going up. last month they actually had a city council meeting about forming a rental task force, and the city council on it. Some guy comes up, the process and the justification. He's a lawyer, ran for council. The justification was that there were no tenants on this task force, which is a fair critique, but there's a fair housing organization, Renewed Hope, which used to be called Hope Housing Opportunities Provided Equal, that was active in the estuary fight, was active when we were fighting in Harbor Island. And they could appoint a tenant, also the shrub board. There's a lot of things that could have been done. But they basically balked and said they're going to have some vague community process with no timeline. And anyway, what I hope will happen, one of the things I'm working with some folks to restart the Alameda NAACP, focus on housing is one of the main areas. And also someone I went to Berkeley with now lives in Alameda and is working with Renewed Hope to form a tenants organization. So our hope is that forming a group like this, because we had a Harbor Island Tenant Association, but having something citywide. And so being able to work with groups like Causa Justa or Just Cause and other groups to actually work for tenants' rights. And then also the NAACP, because there's a lot of other, specifically very racial housing issues and issues around education, school to prison pipeline. Do some work around those things. So all of that for the end, yeah. You can contact Rashid. I'm in the little creative cove, accessible by email. But yeah, thank y'all for y'all time and attention. I can take some questions at this point.
You didn't say whether Prop 14 passed or not.
Yeah, so Proposition 14 did pass in 1964. So that was the I don't know what they yeah, basically the real estate thing to appeal fair housing. So that was passed, and I brought that up in the Alameda context because in Alameda County it had a lower percentage than it did statewide, but in the city of Alameda it was like 70+% of people who voted in favor of that. So yeah, 14 passed, but ultimately the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court struck that down, and then the U.S. Supreme Court didn't hear it.
Prop 14 or
yeah, Proposition 14. Good question.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was very great history. What's the current state of Alameda Housing Authority? Do they have project-based housing, or is it just still Section 8 vouchers?
That's a good question. So it's a little bit, it's both. Actually, sorry, let me look at this thing real quick. 6%, we don't need that. All right, yeah, so right now, the city of Alameda, I'll show y'all this slide. Right now, there are a couple projects. So there's estuary project, not estuary, excuse me, Esperanza projects. There's Parrot Village, Eagle Village, Parrot Eagle. There's one other bird. I don't know what the, yeah, there's no hawk. And then there's also something called Playa del Alameda by Washington Park. So Esperanza is actually being shifted. They're looking at it's a lot of people with the vouchers that live there now, opposed to just being the projects. Playa del still is projects, and it has to be low income for, it was 59 years, so until I think 2040 something. But there is a move to make it where you could move into Esperanza and be market rate. So it's not just those 70 units or whatever, just for only low income folks. But Housing Authority also manages some other properties and works with the Bayport. There's low income housing in the new development, which is on the other side of College Alameda, and it's 52 units called the Breakers. But yeah, to answer your question, they mainly do the Section 8 vouchers at this point.
And people still people from the residents, that they receive some type of one-for-one replacement, or
so for people from Buena Vista,
yeah.
Or so you heard the woman giving the testimony, the older Italian lady giving the testimony about being forced to move, how she just paid to get new things in her home. And so they said that they would give us our rental deposit back. as well as a rental stipend. So initially it was like $250, and then they eventually said they'd give $1,000. So the $1,000, they ended up doing that, but the check they gave my mama bounced. Fortunately, we had money. Yeah, giving out bad checks. That's what bad people do. No, I mean, not saying that's what slumlords do.
Yeah.
And like our rental deposit was like $150. So yeah, you could buy like, you know, a couple meals. So yeah, but it didn't really help a lot of people. Like I said, based on just anecdotal, like people I know that had to move out of Alameda, and 63% of school children having to leave, we estimate that the majority of people left the city of Alameda. But a lot of people were able to move to other parts of Alameda where historically we were kept from moving because of housing discrimination. And I suspect now that they have older housing stock, they're more willing to rent to people who were previously less desirable. But that's not really what you asked me. Yeah.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit more about 15 Group. I'm just looking at escapades. What's going on with them?
Yeah, so I got in touch with some people in Boyle Heights, which is in LA, in the Werverwood or Werverwind apartments.
Yeah.
And so that might be something that pops up.
Yeah.
So they do this thing in different places. They buy distressed housing in certain areas that are like ripe for redevelopment. They neglect it. They collect the rents, meanwhile, but don't put any money in. And 15 Group is 15 groups of property management. Island, which is the reason why they had this task force, is because they would essentially rotate their management company. So once you start getting progress on certain issues, they take them out and put another property management group in. And so they went down to LA and some other places to do the same thing. And so residents, as recently as like a couple months ago, were fighting in Boyle Heights because they're looking to renovate those apartments and kick everybody out. 15 Group ultimately, they sold the apartments to another company, Kennedy Wilson, which is like based in LA but has Walnut Creek offices or somewhere in Contra Costa. They renovated, and so whereas we were paying like $1,000 for a 2-bedroom with a pretty nice, you know, square footage and everything. I know somebody who moved into a similar apartment. That's actually a student now, and she's $100 for the same thing. And they essentially just put a little lipstick on there. You know, they didn't really do any substantive things like earthquake, retro, nothing like that. Yeah, so I know folks have to like go back to other stuff. If you want to excuse yourself, it's all right, but I'll continue to take like questions. I know Steven has a bunch of comments and everything, so he's like.
And just to let everybody know, John's going to be here in about 10 minutes, so he'll need his office back because he has
I have a couple questions about the site. So the original apartment building was not a public housing project. Is that tenants who were using vouchers? Is that correct?
No. So essentially, they were subsidized by the federal government, right? To create these. No, it's another name for it.
Oh, that's right.
But they didn't initially have Section 8 vouchers.
No. I said there's two projects. One through Section 8. Vouchers, project-based funding.
Yeah. And so that one, so it wasn't necessarily projects, but it was basically like they agreed to subsidize it as long as they had that loan. And then they could go back to market rate. And so it's a certain number that they use to designate that kind of housing. But it was a part of that shift from having federal or government-based project stuff to going back to the market, being the ones that had that.
What percentage of the tenants were public housing tenants? That was the whole thing.
Yeah. Hey, thank you.
The whole thing was a public housing, Section 8 public housing unit, a project then? So every tenant there was a public housing tenant?
No. So again, it was like